All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us with a very special Lunch with the Friends program. I'm Chris Knopp. I'm Executive Director of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. And I want to begin by wishing you all health and safety during this time. It looks like there is light at the end of this COVID-19 tunnel, and we can all get through the tunnel together here. For over 40 years, Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness has been the leader in protecting the wilderness areas of the boundary waters and the greater Quetico Superior ecosystem. And the strength of our work and the strength of our organization is really you. All the people that are out there are the strength of our organization. We are a people-focused organization, and people, all of you, are the strength of what we do. Today, our work focuses on three areas: wilderness, people, and community. For the wilderness, there are two mines and one threat. The two mines are twin metals and polymet, and the threat is sulfide mining. And through lawsuits, legislation, and community action, we are successfully defeating both twin metals and polymet. And I thank all of you that have been part of the efforts from the community action perspective, for supporting the legislation and for being there when we've been in court. For the people, we believe there are no boundaries to the boundary waters. And through classroom education, online programs, and scholarships for wilderness canoe trips, we are connecting people of all backgrounds to the wilderness. And that is an essential part of what we do, recognizing that inclusivity and equity must be part of the wilderness discussion. And then finally, for community, we understand that the communities that are gateways to the boundary waters, Ely, Grand Marais, the North Shore, and the like, share a fate with the wilderness itself, and that in order for the wilderness to be protected, that we in fact must have those communities that are that thrive. And we are very excited in the upcoming year to be focusing on those communities. If slavery is the original sin of our Constitution, then the treatment of Native people is certainly the original sin of European conquest of the Americas. And we have an incredibly important presentation today from Karen Diver, the former chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and the former special assistant to President Obama for Native American Affairs. Karen Diver is a leader in the Native American community, and a leader in throughout the country as well, in understanding Native American issues and what our country needs to do better in this area. That treaties and sovereignty must be taken seriously, and so it is. Really, I'm humbled to be able to introduce Karen Diver. So, Karen, please take it away with your presentation on federal Indian policy and its local impact.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. I appreciate very much your interest in learning more about Indigenous equities here in our homelands. I am joining you today from the north end of the Fond du Lac Reservation, my homelands, and we're going to talk a little bit about federal Indian policy. So one of the pushbacks we get when we talk about federal Indian policy and kind of present day Indigenous issues is, excuse me, people say, you know, well, why can't you people just get over it, right? You know, why do we always have to look at all that history? What about today? And that's because policy and that history kind of matters and impacts and informs the reality of today's tribes and how they handle so many issues, whether it's those that impact social indicators or land and natural resources and conservation. So today we're going to take a little stroll through that evolution of federal Indian policy and then talk about current day impacts on tribal lands and tribal homelands. And we'll differentiate what does that mean, tribal lands versus tribal homelands. Okay? So I'm going to talk kind of fast because it's a lot to fit in less than an hour. So there's this notion that, you know, prior to colonization, that there was just this vast wilderness and uninhabited wilderness. And yeah, there were some Indigenous people, but, you know, the country wasn't being used. That was the view from, you know, that Western perspective, the colonizer perspective. And as you can see from this map, no, a lot of tribes, over 600, and they had vast territories. Now, were these hard borders? No, they were user territories, and they did shift, whether it was intertribal conflicts or migration, but the land was being used by indigenous folks. The present day Anishinaabe, or Chippewa, actually, we were more of an Eastern Coast tribe. We were always Great Lakes and woodlands, but we were more towards the eastern part of the country. And then there was a prophecy that said that we needed to move west and look for where the food grows on the water. And if we didn't do that, we would perish. So that migration began like 400 AD and ended up ending about 800 AD with the Anishinaabe living where they currently do. Now, mind you, groups of them did stop along the way and populate along the way. So you actually see Anishinaabe people all the way from Lake Huron in Canada, all the way into Saskatchewan, and then on this in the US border, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, into North Dakota, and into Wyoming, actually. The seventh stopping place ended up being Madeline Island. And the final stopping place, that was the sixth stopping place, because some went north along Lake Superior, some went south. The sixth stopping place was actually Spirit Island, in the Lake Superior estuary, the St. Louis River. So for the Fond du Lac band, you know, this was our final stopping point. We had the village along the St. Louis River. We had Spirit Island and Spirit Mountain were places that we used, and there was wild rice abundant in the St. Louis River at that time. So during that colonial period, the British and the French actually made treaties with tribes they came across. And people say, well, you know, those are really old. Well, the importance of them is that treaties can only be made between sovereigns, and under international law, it has to be on a government-to-government basis, sovereign to sovereign. And so that clearly tells you that what you know, colonizers and settlers found here were organized societies that had some sense of decision-making structure, had leadership that could be negotiated with. This is different than indigenous peoples in other parts of the world, like Australian Aborigines, where they had very organized groups, but they just conquered them. They didn't use treaty making. So treaty making recognized that the British, you know, envoys of the British government were actually dealing with other governmental entities. The graphic is really just a treaty written back in the day. And, you know, the interesting thing is they were all written in English, you know, interpreters were used. You had to kind of use some level of faith that negotiations were in good faith, and what was written was actually reflective of the conversations. Most of the European conquest of the United States was based on, in the beginning, was based on this doctrine of discovery, which was actually a papal bull that said that if you go someplace and you find peoples that aren't Christian, that you can take their lands for your respective crown. So there you had kind of organized religion kind of weighing in on exploring and conquest of lands across the world, not just the US. After initial colonization, you had this constitutional era, and you had these treaties that were in place all along, you know, the eastern seaboard and inland. And much like any other legal documents, you write them and then you have to interpret them later. And in this case, you had 3 seminal Indian law cases that were under the Marshall Court, Supreme Court Justice Marshall. And he started to define what did those treaties mean. And what they meant, according to the Marshall Court, was that the treaties created what was called a trust responsibility. All of the treaty language was that the U.S. would cease hostilities against tribes, that tribes would make land cessations in return. They would be paid by the federal government, taking tribes under their care or trust. And this was everything from health, well, it has been interpreted to be health, welfare, education, housing. But the court ruled it had a legally enforceable fiduciary duty that tribes paid for with land. And these treaties also said that while tribes were ceding land, they held usufructuary rights, meaning land rights, land title, the right to continue to use the land according to traditional means. It also reinforced the political status of tribes, that they have nationhood status and that they retain the inherent rights to self-govern. And you can look at those cases that I've noted as the Marshall Trilogy. The next era of federal Indian law was allotment and then assimilation. So the treaties were still continuing to, in the beginning part of this era, as westward expansion continued. But at the same token, westward expansion was creating stressors on the East Coast for land. And Congress and the executive branch undertook a number of steps to kind of undermine Indian land tenure and land rights of tribes. One was the Dawes Act, the General Allotment Act. Up until that time, tribes had held their land in common as a commonwealth for all of their citizens. And because we were users of land and never viewed ourselves as owners, this idea of being allotted to individual Indians an acreage, 40 or to 120 acres, that would be held by singular families and individuals, that wasn't something that was normally understood by us. But what it also did is it didn't divide up reservation lands by the number of, they used adult male head of household. So following this really patriarchal form of land ownership that mirrored Europe, right? Even though, like for the Anishinaabe, it was women who really were the ones who decided what to do with those things. But anyway, the Dawes Indian Allotment Act wasn't divided evenly around acres available versus citizens, and so there was surplus that was created. The act allowed for anything that was declared surplus within reservation borders to be awarded by the government to settlers. So immediately 90 million acres of Indian land within the borders of existing reservations ended up losing its status and violating the treaties. And this was actually by a government official said it's taking land away that we promised in treaties. I mean, you could even see a sign. I mean, they weren't even subtle about it back then. Come get your Indian land. Anyway, also during this period, from a social standpoint, there was removal from land. Identity and culture is tied to homelands, but at the same time, that Native identity was under threat. Fully 30% of Native children were stolen from their families and put into boarding schools. The effect of this was that they wanted to remove them from family connections, cultural connections, language. They would target tribal leaders so that it would break the will of families to fight. Families would move to be near their children. The initial policy was that children should be at least 60 miles away because they didn't understand we were users of territory. That wasn't far enough and families would find their children. So the official policy was changed to 120 miles away. Now you might be thinking, that's terrible. Boy, we're sure glad that's over. It lasted until the 1970s, just so you're aware. But that's not what this training's about. This one's more land focused. But this was generations and generations of families who lost their children to the boarding school era. They were able to return. Many of them were broken because you just can't do these things to children and think it'll be okay. The allotment and assimilation era also was the time when you heard about the Trail of Tears, where Andrew Jackson just outright started moving the 5 civilized tribes east of the Mississippi to west. If you're ever wondering why there's so many tribes in Oklahoma, that wasn't their original homeland. Jackson, despite the Supreme Court ruling saying that he shouldn't do it, he did it anyway and did it under the military. Tens of thousands of natives were killed in that forced kind of march across the United States. They did throw us a bone, though. In 1924, we were given citizenship and allowed to vote, but of course that was only the men, right? Okay. During the era of reorganization from 34 to 53, things changed a little bit. And in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, and what it said was that they were tired of trying to figure out who was in charge of tribes. Of the over 500 tribes, they had 500 forms of governance that had worked for them since time immemorial. They had structures that they followed. It wasn't always readily transparent to bureaucrats out of Washington who was in charge, because some of them were theocracies, etc. They imposed tribal constitutions on tribes and said, if you want to keep doing business, so to speak, with the federal government, you need to adopt these Reorganization Act Constitution. It was a nonprofit model. It's set up for popular elections. This was the first time we've heard about blood quantum and blood purity, and that you needed to be 1/4% Indian blood to be a citizen of your nation. And they called them members, not citizens, even though these were political units. But this was the kind of a long strategy of assimilation, right? It said that your identity didn't come from your kinship and from your tribe's determination as citizens, but from this notion of blood purity. And it was also a long game strategy of assimilation, because if you didn't intermarry, you wouldn't meet the blood quantum and this Indian problem. And that, I'm doing it in quote because that's what federal policy said, the Indian problem would go away. Didn't work, but that's what they tried. The termination era actually took us backwards in a big way. And I wanted to kind of give some context a little bit for this era. So this was pre-civil rights, right? This is when it was all kind of bubbling up, and there were tensions building in the South, and there was really some institutional kind of pushback and tension and kind of retrenchment of kind of the old versus the new, right? And some of that backlash against people asking for civil rights actually landed on the doorsteps of tribes. This started to reverse some of that work that the federal government did to enable tribes to be self-governing because they are their own political units. It actually just terminated tribes. Congress, the Marshall Court says that Congress has plenary power over Indian country. What does plenary mean? It's a fancy legal term for total power. And so Congress passed some acts that just took away tribal recognition from some tribes. They not only lost their remaining reservation homelands, they lost their status to call themselves as members of a tribe, couldn't access any federal monies that might have been coming for schools or housing, health, etc. It also started some state control over federal lands. Public Law 280 is around criminal jurisdiction. That's why in Minnesota, state laws, criminal laws apply on reservations. In other states, Public Law 280, they chose not to be a part of it. Minnesota was mandated to be a part of it. And so this was relieving the federal government of some obligation to provide policing on reservations. Today, it causes huge jurisdictional issues. Who's in charge when? What's the status of the state? Is it Public Law 280? How do tribal police departments interact with other police departments, etc. And so those are all governmental challenges that tribes have to work out. The Indian Relocation Act tried to a different means of assimilating Native people. The Relocation Act says that they would provide incentives to move Natives into major urban areas, provide them job training assistance, help them find work, a lot of the trades, hairstylists, welders, truck drivers, things like that. And you saw a major uptick in urban natives. Around this time, though, the American Indian movement, who was working on civil rights for Native folks, started urban Indian centers and created places for Indigenous folks to find community and help them with transition efforts. Now, mind you, at the same time, the economies were quite bad on reservations. So, the incentive to be financially secure was something that also drew folks into this program. Most of them did not assimilate, however, and the American Indian movement creating these urban communities really helped with that. From 1968 on, tribes were the beneficiaries of all of the good stuff that came out of the civil rights era. A federal control of tribal activities and governmental activities ended. Tribes had to prove, however, that they had the administrative capabilities to manage their own affairs, but they were able to start natural resource programs, health programs, schools, health, housing programs. Treaty rights at that time were actually affirmed in the Bolt decision, that treaties were still the law of the land. They hadn't been terminated by any actions by tribes or the feds, and that any use of usufructuary rights remain in effect, meaning that where tribal treaties said that we retain, even though we're ceding land, we retain the right to use it for culture, hunting, fishing, gathering, that those rights were still in effect. There was also a number of other significant policies, the Civil Rights Act, a companion document granting Native people civil rights, education assistance, housing assistance. Indian Child Welfare Act says you're not allowed to steal our kids anymore and put them in the child welfare system and adopt them out and remove them from their communities. The Indian Land Consolidation Act said we can, where those surplus lands within borders were created, causing this checkerboarding, that tribes could start to buy land back and consolidate their reservations. With the advent of economic development and tribes really understanding they needed to figure out how to have money to fund governmental services, the Gaming Regulatory Act provided a framework for that to occur. And then in 1990, the American Graves and Protection Act, meaning no longer digging up our ancestors and putting them in museums and things like that, that all of those had to come home if you receive federal funding. I know I'm talking fast, hang in there with me. All right, so what does this mean? What's Indian land? What is the 1854 treaty? And what does allyship look like in conservation? And what are some best practices in building relationships? Reservation lands are actually held by the Department of Interior on behalf of the band. I'm using the term band and tribe interrelated. Bands are the same ethnic group of a tribe, but they have independent governing authority, and they have what's called tribal recognition on their own. For the bands in the Arrowhead, they're also part of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, because when they did the Reorganization Act, they made a share constitution. Although we have local governing, local decision-making, and inherent sovereignty as individual bands, we share the same constitution, which is defines what does tribal citizenship look like, as well as elections and things like that. So we don't own our land. It's held by the Department of Interior. Remember that Marshall Trilogy that says there's this duty of care? So a part of the trust responsibility, duty of care, is they don't think we can manage our own lands. There's this all these approval processes. They move more towards tribal self-governance on different issues, but they're still basically federal lands held on our behalf. There's reservation lands held by the bands themselves, allotment lands held by individuals or lots of individuals, and private lands. Fond du Lac also has conservation lands. The exception to this is Red Lake, because they were never allotted. They never agreed to allotment, so all of the lands are held by Red Lake in common. All right, I'm going to use Fond du Lac as an example, although all of the reservations, Grand Portage is pretty intact. They haven't lost too much. But Fond du Lac, when I say it's checkerboarded, look at all the different kinds of lands. The light green is Fond du Lac lands that are held in fee status, meaning they're paying taxes and waiting for the federal government to say that they're reservation lands. Fond du Lac owns the medium colored green. The dark green, it would be the lands held by allottees that were given out under that Dawes Indian Allotment Act. We can't sell them. We can lease them and have initial approval here, but final authority goes to the Department of Interior when they actually record the leases in their bureaucracy. We also have county, state, University of Minnesota lands, private land held by the tribes, individual tribal members, and non-natives. So even within our borders, we're not even talking the arrowhead, different types of land status. Allotment lands, once again, acres of land per head of household. A lot of that was taken through probates because it passed to a non-Indian heir. It would pass to all of the heirs. You couldn't designate one because of the weird probates we have. So some of these tracts of allotment lands now have 3,000 heirs, and tribes are trying to reacquire them by eminent domain. So then we're talking about the ceded territory, of which the Boundary Waters is a part. The ceded territory is the specific area of land that in the Treaty of La Pointe that the bands reserve the right to hunt, fish, and gather in. And you are wholly located, the Boundary Waters is wholly located within that. So people say, you know, some of the language you hear around treaty rights is, you know, why can't we all be the same? That was old. You know, it shouldn't be in effect for today. Tribes actually feel like they paid for this. They paid for this by ceding everything that you see outlined in red in order to have the small pieces in maroon. So, you know, it's a contractual arrangement, correct? What happens when you don't follow contracts, right? You know, what is our reparations if you're not going to follow it? Well, the fact of the matter is tribes don't want reparations. What they want is the right to be indigenous and to hunt, fish, and gather in the normal and customary ways, because we view this as caretaking and interacting with our mother. So it's just different kind of relational status that gets away from that Western notion of like ownership and using those resources, where for us it's a part of a life way, right? Grand Portage in '85 sued the state of Minnesota around the rights to hunt, fish, and gather. A lot of tribes were doing this from one end of the country to another because states were trying to enforce state regulations on tribes and not recognizing that they have these inherent treaty rights that were done through negotiation. All three bands in the Arrowhead joined in. It ended up being settled. The 1854 Treaty Authority was created. Fond du Lac kind of went their own way, but I probably should say it's Grand Portage, Bois Forte, and Fond du Lac, right, in the ceded territory. They settled the suit. Tribes started to develop their own conservation and hunting, fishing, and gathering framework for their tribal citizens, and they agreed to do co-management of fish and wildlife with the state. They cross-deputized game wardens. Grand Portage and Bois Forte agreed to abide by regulations that were consistent with the state in exchange for small yearly payments. Fond du Lac citizens, did not agree to that, and so Fond du Lac pulled out. So we self-govern independently. So when tribes sit at the table with the state of Minnesota around regulation, safe harvest, all of that, you'll have the 1854 Treaty Authority, Fond du Lac, and the state. In the ceded territory, you see tribal natural resources managers really building up their capacity. You know, we didn't just want the right to hunt, fish, and gather. We wanted the right to hunt, fish, and gather in a way that was culturally appropriate and responsible. And we knew that using traditional ecological knowledge was good enough for us, but we also knew we had to sit at the table with state managers and in some cases interact with federal managers. So they started really building their capacity under their own self-governance and hiring Western trained managers of fish, wildlife, water quality, forest managers, and invasive species. They do some of this in coordination with intertribal consortia like the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, but they also undertook restoration activities, cleaning up brownfields, you know, adopting the Kyoto Protocol, working on renewables, you know, climate change mitigation measures, and understanding what's going to happen to our homelands over time because of climate change, and what are things we could do to manage proactively and effectively and be good stewards and take that responsibility seriously. When we talk about conservation sector allyship, this ends up being a little difficult, right? Because most conservation groups are mainstream, not indigenous, and they look at it from a very Western point of view. They look at wilderness as something to recreate in, and you know, it approaches more of kind of the Commonwealth idea. Tribes look at these things somewhat differently, right? And you know, just not to be repetitive, but you know, it's kind of like wolf hunting. You know, they're delisting it, and right away there's going to be a hunt of it. Well, for the Anishinaabe, the wolf is like our brother, and our stories say to us, "As the fate of the wolf, so does mankind," because the wolf is our brother, and so it would be like killing your brother, right? But everything ends up being from that user of wilderness rather than being that relative of wilderness. And so when we talk about conservation group, we need to decolonize it. In other words, it can't only be from a Western perspective. There's something to be learned from indigenous perspectives. And that's what all of you are doing here today. So miigwech for that. Thank you. Because more of these conversations need to be had. Often conservation allyship means, you know, that they want to glom on to the equities of tribal governance, meaning because tribes sit at the table as governmental entities, you know, whether there's permitting decisions or other interactions with the feds, you know, they want to kind of take over that kind of governmental status of tribes. And that's really not what tribes are looking for. They're looking for allies who will amplify their message, support their message, but recognize that they're not an interest group, they're a government. And these are our homelands, and our ties to them aren't just governmental, they're cultural and spiritual as well. But preservation of tribal lands or public lands across the country really came at the expense of tribal territories, taking them away from tribes for the benefit of majority population. And the more we remember that, maybe the more these conversations of equity and allyship will be informed by correct history, correct? All right. The lowest bar is a land acknowledgement, saying whose land you're on, learning the nice words, bonjour, miigwech, hello, thank you. The medium bar is really building understanding of tribal interests, identifying where those interests align and where they don't, and having conversations about how to handle that. Amplify tribal voices, don't speak for them. Diversify your leadership, but don't make Indigenous folks carry the organization's burden of not only, you know, of not being so, you know, mainstream and not diverse. And then once again, understanding tribes are taking care of their relatives when we take care of natural resources. All right. Highest bar, tribes are consulted about policy and regulations that would affect their homelands and their relatives. I just talked about the wolves. When they delisted the wolves, they should have undertaken tribal consultation. Any other federal government entity at any other point in time would have done consultation with tribes before they did that. Does consultation mean they'll always listen to us? Obviously not, but that conversation should have been had. Support tribal sovereignty. We're another governmental entity, and people think, wow, this is really hard. Well, when you talk about supporting tribes and government, it shouldn't be that hard. You know, we're in Minnesota and we understand Canada's different and has different rules and inherent right to make their own decisions. We understand it at a state level, that Wisconsin isn't always going to be like Minnesota. We understand that from counties and cities and townships. It's interjurisdictional. When we start to think about tribes as just another jurisdiction, the conversation shouldn't seem as scary and hard, right? That we should have the right to make decisions for ourselves in the best interests of our own citizens and our own needs. Recognizing that traditional ecological knowledge actually is science, and it's a valid technique. It's called observation, and so I usually tell folks, you know, if white scientists can undertake observation and have it be a valid point of view, then actually having 4 to 6 to 8 to thousands of years of tribal ecological knowledge, guess what? That's science too. And then continue to work with us and reach out where you can respectfully to see what tribal equities are and find out what we value, because what we value ends up being very different than the rest of the communities around us. We're not necessarily profit motivated, we're community motivated, we are resilient, we are about maintaining our lifeways for our children and who we are as Indigenous folks, and taking care of our relatives. And I just talked really fast at all of you. So I'm going to take questions.
Great. Karen, thank you so much for that great presentation that opens our eyes and informs our mind about things that we need to know much more about here. And there are a number of questions here, and I'm going to and please keep presenting your questions in the Q&A part function area here. There was an initial question that gets to the land ownership of the Fond du Lac Reservation, and the question was the person had understood that the Fond du Lac band had bought back 90% of the land within the reservation, and you know, maybe you want to talk about how much is actually how much within the reservation itself is owned by the Fond du Lac government.
Okay, so I was talking about Grand Portage that has very cohesive. They've lost very little land, and then we're able to reclaim some. Fond du Lac, I think they're at about 38% of the land within their borders. So a little over 1/3 of their land are actually owned or controlled by the tribe or tribal members. And it's been a big priority, and we've gotten into a bit of kerfuffles here and there with other jurisdictions who don't like us reclaiming our land, and we're okay with that.
So that's an extraordinary thing. So after the ceded territories under the 1854 treaty within the reservation itself, what was left, only 38% is now tribally owned. So it really shows the impact.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I misunderstood your question. I meant the land within the Fond du Lac Reservation borders.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So the fact that after the territory had been ceded, that within the reservation itself, only 38% is within the tribal ownership. So
yeah, that's correct.
That's the sort of impact that everyone needs to understand, that the Dawes Act of 1887 there, when it was in a perverse effort to try to turn Native people into white farmers, ended up taking the land that was within the reservation.
Yeah, they took the land that was able to be farmed. So when they allotted the land to tribal members, they gave us a lot of the wetlands.
Mhm.
And a part of the Dawes Act was they would give us like a blacksmith to the reservation and like horses and stuff. And yeah, we were hunter gatherers. They wanted us to be farmers, but then the allotments that they gave us were wetlands. Um, and then we needed permission to leave the reservation. So when you talk about, this right to hunt, fish, and gather in all of the Arrowhead region, we had to have permission from the Indian agent back in the day to leave the borders. So, these were really just kind of larger concentration camps, right? We didn't have free passage to go use those treaty rights. And so then people got used to us not using them.
And that 38% that is reservation owned. I mean, emphasize that so-called trust relationship, that sort of paternalistic nature of to have the most control over the property. It really has to be owned by the federal government, the U.S. government.
So jurisdictional issues end up becoming a little dicey, right? So I'll use myself as an example so I don't have to talk about anybody else. I own private land. I bought it on the market, 43 acres. But because I'm a tribal citizen, tribal jurisdiction would apply. And it wouldn't apply to a non-native who owns private land. Tribal regulations would apply to allotment lands and to lands that the tribe leases to its citizens. So most of what we do have within our borders, and every band in the ceded territory is like this, they'll give home site leases, they'll give agriculture leases if you want to do a hay field or something, and those are generally 25 to 30 years. But then we send that lease to the Department of Interior for them to do final sign off.
Mhm.
So then it's subject to all of that weird federal probate issues. And so tribes are generally, through their own self-governing, creating ordinances and policies where they're slowly kind of pushing the federal government out of some of these functions just because they're really not good at it. They don't keep track well. Tribes have had to undertake huge land assessments just to figure out title and how the land came to be private. Was this one of them original settlers back in the day, or did it go into tax forfeit and nobody claimed it? So land issues end up becoming just overly complicated. But right now, tribes are probably doing the best research on it.
Mhm. Great. Thank you, Karen. And we have a number of questions related to the proper terminology, proper language for us to use. So, and should we use terms like Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Ojibwe, Native American, American Indian? What is the appropriate language for us to use here?
I'm going to answer a different question first. I was asked, is my 43 acres legally owned by the federal government? No, I own it. It's private. I have not turned it over to the tribe. I can sell it to anybody, non-native, native, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is I had the means to own acreage, and I will offer it to the tribe on a right of first refusal when I no longer want it or through my will. And if they don't want it, then my kids can do with it what they want. Okay, so there's that. And so what should you call us? Best practice is to call us the name we call ourselves. Anishinaabe, which means the original people, that is the name we have for ourselves. Chippewa or Ojibwe is a name that other people called us. The French called us Ojibwe. They think it was a bastardization of Ojibwe, which means puckered toe moccasin. So they actually named us after our footwear. Our puckered toe moccasins. So yeah, that was good. And they think Chippewa was kind of them not pronouncing Ojibwe, which was Ojibwe properly. So yes, best practice is to call us Anishinaabe. So.
Great. And then another. Well, maybe a question. What recommendations do you have for the incoming Biden administration with respect to Native rights here?
They can start by undoing the last 4 years. They've been systemically kind of dismantling the Bureau of Indian Affairs and those tribal leaning and forward facing parts of the Department of Interior. I would obviously want them to restore Bears Ears and Grand Escalante national monuments. Those are tribal historic areas and tribally managed areas. All of the environmental stuff. Obviously, I would want to follow the Historic Preservation Act and restore good science at the EPA and actually have really public processes around permitting and environmental decisions. I mean, I don't even want to think of like how much work they have to do to put things back together to actually serve the American people again, but that'd be a good start. There's also a question regarding the Cloquet Forestry Center. As chairwoman, I had many conversations with the University of Minnesota. I'll make no bones about it. Fond du Lac wants it back. After the Dawes Indian Allotment Act, the timber barons of the era banded together and got an act passed through Congress that granted 3,000 of the best acres on Fond du Lac that isn't wetland to the University of Minnesota. And our relationship as a tribe with them has been fairly non-existent. You know, we've proposed everything from working with our tribal college to, you know, doing school to work activities, getting our high schoolers in there. I have some faith that understanding that university systems across the country have, you mentioned the Morrill Act, a lot of school trust lands that fund higher ed were actually Indian lands that were taken and continue to benefit higher ed across the country even today, and the University of Minnesota is one of them. And while they can do something specifically with the Forestry Center, I would say that their obligation goes even higher than just the Forestry Center, that a part of the wealth of the University of Minnesota system was created around the taking of tribal lands, and they owe some duty to do better by Native learners and Native communities, and they should give it some serious thought.
Great, great. You know, one, kind of a big issue revolves around retained rights and this special rights, but that maybe you could address the rights in the ceded territories. You know, that they're retained rights and not special rights. So if there are different hunting and angling regulations that apply to native users of those public lands, you know, where that comes from, kind of, you know, you hear that a lot, you know, obviously with respect to Mille Lacs, it's been a big issue, but you know, we're in the 1854 ceded territories here, maybe speak to that as well.
Yeah, and I talked about it during the presentation, but you know, I'm talking really fast here, and I get that, so I apologize to all of you. So let me expand on that since you asked. You know, when people say you have special rights and they were given to you and you should take them away, no, we always had them. Before anybody else was here, we were hunting, fishing, and gathering. And the 1854 treaty actually says we will cede this acreage to you, but we specifically retain the right to hunt, fish, and gather in customary ways in that area. And that was the essence of the litigation with the state of Minnesota, is to say that right is still in place. So the analogy I use to folks about retained rights, something we had and specifically never gave up, was to use, let's say you live in Oklahoma and your neighbor hits oil. And every night now you're going to bed and you're hearing because you see the oil derrick going and it's getting on your nerves. So you want to move and sell your property. But what if there's oil under your property? So you move, but you retain the mineral rights. You sell it, you sell the surface land, you retain the mineral rights. You retained it. You retain the mineral rights. The rights to hunt, fish, and gather are retained rights, something we had and we specifically kept. And that's been recognized by the Supreme Court and numerous federal court decisions. So when you see tribes, they're using science to make decisions around harvest. using their own scientists. Our scientists interact with other scientists from the state, other tribes. They determine what's a safe harvest. Under treaty, we are guaranteed a right to take 50% of any allowable harvest. And rarely, if ever, do we do that. Now, I'll use the Mille Lacs case because Fond du Lac also fishes there. We count every fish. We weigh it, we count it, we measure it. Sport anglers do not do that. And it's less than 10% of the harvestable catch. But yet it's a good scapegoat to say, oh, the Indians are ruining Mille Lacs. No, climate change is ruining Mille Lacs. Poor management is ruining Mille Lacs. Over harvesting of the wrong slot size is hurting Mille Lacs. And why do tribes know this? Because we use science too. But it's easier to default and to blame than it is to say, and you see this during this current era with COVID, that I might have to change my behavior. I have to change my behavior or what I think I'm entitled to, then pretty soon it's somebody else's fault, right?
Well, you were talking about the capacity of tribal natural resource management. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about what the Fond du Lac Band is doing throughout the entire 1854 treaty area, because it's really extraordinary. The restoration of wild rice lakes, and all throughout the entire arrowhead here. And maybe you want to talk about the capacities that the Fond du Lac Band has there.
So all of the tribes actually, what we've done is we've kind of worked on our understanding of the whole territory. So we'll work with Grand Portage, we'll work with scientists from Boyce Ford and their water quality managers, their wildlife managers. And, unfortunately, we tend to look at these things in kind of silos of the individual disciplines, right? But you can't talk about water quality without talking about good forest management. You can't talk about good forest management without talking about how it's going to be impacted by climate change. You can't talk about moose without talking about quantity of water and what's happening to wetlands and foraging spaces, and forestry management and how we handle all of those things. What do they eat? How do they cool down? Climate change with winter ticks. And so one thing nice about tribes is, we are small enough to have these really comprehensive interdisciplinary conversations around how we look at these things. And then where we don't have capacity, we can work in concert with one another to get the capacity. Example, one of the questions is around mining. Tribes aren't generally anti-extractive industry, but they are against pollution. So we will not sacrifice good quality natural resources stewardship just to make somebody else a profit and not hold them accountable for how they do that work or for long-term or short-term impact that they don't manage just because they want to make more money, right? So for example, when we were looking at the hydrology studies for twin metals, we just thought they didn't make common sense, but we didn't have a hydrologist on staff. No tribe would have enough permits to review to justify that expense. So we worked with the other tribes in the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission because we're actually interested in basin-wide impacts from mining. Because it's going on in Canada, it's going on in Michigan, it's going on in Wisconsin, and we need to have that kind of balcony level view of what's happening to Lake Superior. So we worked in concert with others to get a hydrologist, a professional hydrological study. So Fond du Lac was the one in consortia with these tribes that found out that their hydrology study was wrong, and they were going to be sending all that waste product north. The corruptness of our permitting system is that we allow the company to hire their own engineers to do their own environmental reviews and then accept them as the science of which permitting should take place. And so, if we're looking at regulation changes, that might be a good one. It should be subject to independent verification and peer review.
And we have, Many questions here, and we're coming towards the end here, but perhaps you could talk a bit about the impact of Fond du Lac on the economy of Northeast Minnesota, and then how big of a positive impact it has on the economy of Northeast Minnesota.
So people say like, well, why do tribes do this? Tribes do it because most traditional governmental services are funded by taxes. And we don't have a tax base. We don't do property taxes. Most of our folks, they're taking care of large extended families for the ones who are in, a good enough place, to have a home. So how do we raise money for essential government services? Because if anybody thinks the federal government has ever lived up to their obligations to take care of us, you'll only need to look at the social indicators. So tribes run businesses because that's their tribal treasury. That's how Fond du Lac pays for buses for Head Start and health insurance for Head Start teachers, because we know turnover in early ed has adverse impact on school readiness. It's how we fund Meals on Wheels for our elders and all of these other scholarship programs. So we've grown and tried to diversify. We can do better, but we're the second largest employer in all of northeastern Minnesota. There's 2,200 employees. The only larger employer is the Essentia Health System. We're a large driver of the rural economy down in Carlton, Minnesota, and Cloquet, the Cloquet area, and in fact, import employees all the way into Wisconsin, up the North Shore. So we're a huge employer, and we do it because it allows us to take care of our community and our natural landscape and our relatives.
Great. Why, thank you so much.
Let me do this real quick. If you want to work with tribes on wild rice, call their natural resources department, ask who's working on that. And see if you can tell them you'd like to do a partnership. Let's see. How do we choose what scientists to work and if they are only from a specific tribe? No, we take anybody who's qualified. We have tribal preference in hiring. Our tribe first, then Minnesota Chippewa tribe, then any tribe, but qualifications matter. I think that's everything.
Great. Why, Karen, again, Megwich, thank you so much for your time this afternoon and for sharing your knowledge with us. Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness is a place-based organization, but Anishinaabe people are a place-based people, and we need to recognize that as advocates for the Boundary Waters that we are on Anishinaabe land. As an organization, we strive to be a learning organization and one that is more inclusive and equitable. And this is an ongoing process and an evolving process for us at Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. And we also recognize that we present a Western perspective on land management, and we need to recognize there are many other perspectives and that we need to understand the Anishinaabe perspective on land. So going forward here, for all of you that are friends of the Boundary Waters, we will continue our effort to add more voices to our chorus here, and thanks to all of you for being our supporters. And Megwich, thank you so much, Karen, for sharing your time this afternoon. We're very, very grateful.
Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it.
Goodbye.